What did the Battle of Cannae actually look like? Modelling the Battle of Cannae in true size is a gargantuan undertaking. A battle featuring one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled, whose frontage was so vast that it would take over 40 minutes to walk across, and so deep that you could fit an entire soccer field between the front and the rear ranks. Even Napoleonic artillery stationed at one end of the field would lack the range to reach more than half of the army before it. Such are the scales we are dealing with. Without the benefit of a time machine, this has long been left a mystery. However, in this series we leverage the expertise of historians such as Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy and the power of tools like Unreal Engine 5 to bring the past to life with the most detailed simulation of this climactic battle ever attempted. From the often overlooked scale of the city-sized camps which hosted the vast armies assembled that day, to the hours-long logistical nightmare of deploying 130,000 men from these camps into formations on the field of battle, and the stunning blow-by-blow phases by which Hannibal managed the incredible feat of enveloping and destroying an army twice his size. We bring you back in time to experience it all from both a bird's-eye perspective in the skies above and the boots on the ground in the thick of the action. The skirmishers, the cavalry, the infantry, and the generals. The end result is a revolutionary new way to not only visualize the massive battles of antiquity, but to derive novel academic conclusions which challenge how we understand them. So today, let's dive into this fascinating simulation. This is the true size of the Battle of Cannae.
Hey everyone, it's Julian. No sponsor segment here. I just wanted a chance to speak to you human to human for a couple minutes. So the video that you'll watch today is very near and dear to my heart. I've been making history documentaries here on YouTube for over 10 years, and actually 12 years ago is one of my very first history documentaries on the Battle of Cannae. So here we go, full circle, 12 years on. Now, back in the day, I was heavily inspired by the work of Adrian Goldsworthy. He is my muse. He's the reason why I got into history. Very much the way he made history approachable and engaging is what inspired me to try and do the same, but in a video format. Now, when we were doing so early on, I was using Google Earth, my primitive use of Photoshop, and then using heavily the engine of Rome Total War. Now, 12 years on, I think we've shown in this video leaps and strides how far we've come. So, on a technical side, Unreal Engine has been great to master, especially with a team that I have behind my back, dialing up that realism, getting a lot closer to history, and making it much more understandable, approachable. We can do this POV stuff that you'll enjoy. Another cool thing is that my muse, Adrian Goldsworthy, is no longer just trapped in the book here, but he's with us in the video. I got the chance to, speak to him, collaborate with him, and so that's been awesome to have him on the program for me on a personal level, but then also for him as well. He's been, 10 years on, able to now reflect more on his discoveries as a researcher, as a historian, and shed new lights and insight on this topic. So overall, this video is sort of quintessential in terms of what it means for me to be on YouTube making these documentaries. Now, we've done a lot more stuff in the past, and I hope to be here 10 years on. But admittedly, we are facing a lot of headwinds. You'll see this across the YouTube space when it comes to educational and history channels, when it comes to things like AI, what that means for production, competition of viewer attention, discoverability, how sponsors and money gets thrown into the mix. Suffice to say, we are in a tough spot. Myself financially, we've been kind of struggling on the channel. So I've never been one to really, beg for views, beg for money. I will find ways to keep sustaining the channel so that I can keep making these documentaries and check in with you guys 10 years on. But I do want to say every little bit does count. So please subscribe, like the video, become a YouTube member, join us on Patreon, and especially, just grab something on our store. I made all these little custom mugs that have history memes built into them. I hope you enjoy them, and we have some cool stuff that we've commissioned over the years from artists, like this map of Carthage that I have myself in my home that I think you'll appreciate. So no matter what you choose to do, I can't thank you enough for the support over the years, whether you've been watching us for decades or for the last couple of years, or even just in this video. Thank you so much for staying along, supporting human-made work, supporting history, and yeah, again, I can't thank you guys enough, and enjoy the video. I'll see you in the next one.
Modelling the Battle of Cannae in true size is a gargantuan undertaking. While we shall be presenting our reconstruction, other interpretations exist. In acknowledgement of this fact, it will be best to begin by describing the key assumptions of our model. First, we can begin in the abstract with the army sizes. Here, Polybius tells us that the Romans deployed 16 legions, 8 Roman and 8 allied, which in total numbered 80,000 infantry and roughly 6,000 cavalry. Assuming an average distribution of soldiers, we find that each legion has 5,000 men, with the following breakdown of troop types. At the smallest level, this means each century, with the exception of the Triarii, has on average 73 men. A roughly 20% increase over the 60 men who were part of the usual muster. Such inflated figures are in keeping with the idea that the army had been deliberately supersized by Rome in an attempt to outmuscle Hannibal. The cavalry, on the other hand, were proportionately much smaller, consisting of but 7.5% of the total troop count. This was due to recent losses and the difficulty of finding sufficient mounts on such short notice. Breaking out these riders, we have assumed each Roman legion musters 10 termi of 30 troopers for a total of 2,400 cavalry. This leaves us with a remainder of 3,600 for the Allies, which roughly tracks with Livy's sources, claiming the Allies had provided twice as many horsemen. The entire force is under the command of consuls Paulus and Varro, with command alternating each day. On the Carthaginian side, Polybius tells us that Hannibal deployed 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, making their size 58% that of the Romans. Beyond this, we have but informed speculation to go on. Based on accounts of prior battles in the campaign, we shall assume the following distribution of infantry units. Though greatly outnumbered by their Roman equivalents, these are well-seasoned veteran troops who have also been able to upgrade their gear through the spoils of victory. As for the cavalry, we will assume 4,000 are Gallic, 2,000 are Iberian, and 4,000 are Numidian. In this singular category, does Hannibal actually outnumber his foe with 66% more riders? This will prove to have grave consequences. Taken all together, we see that there are in total 136,000 troops accounted for. An insanely large army, which was even more numerous when we consider the likely presence of thousands more support forces and camp followers. Now let us transport the armies to the battlefield of Cannae. But to do so requires knowing exactly where that is. It's a rather thorny issue for any attempted recreations of the battle. To offer insight on this matter, we can now turn to Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy.
The sources for Cannae are pretty good for a battle in the ancient world, and we can narrow down the location fairly well. We know where the ancient town of Cannae was. Beyond that, everything gets a little bit more difficult. Our best sources tell us about the orientation of the armies in relation to the river Aufidius. The problem is that this river is on a wide, fairly flat plain and moves regularly. I visited the site when I was doing research for my books in the late 90s. I took with me all the maps I could find from various scholarly analyses, some of them dating back to the 19th century, some of them 20th century. I also had a modern Italian road map of the area, as big a scale as I could find. And when I came there, the first thing that struck me was that A, the river was in a different position on each of these maps, but also the river I could see in front of me on that summer's afternoon was again on a different line to all the maps that I had. It just emphasized how much the river moves across this floodplain, which then means that trying to understand if, as I argue, the battle did occur between the river and the hill on which the town of Cannae stood, just how much space there was, how wide was this plain, and was it possible that you could actually fit these very large armies into that space. So there are lots of problems with Cannae that nature doesn't help with. There hasn't been any archaeology that we could really establish the battlefield, even if that's possible. You have to be lucky to find the right things. There's talk of earlier finds, but they may be confused with medieval battles fought near there as well. We can't narrow down where the river was in 216 BC. So there's a lot of guesswork involved, which is why looking in this way and mapping in this way and doing everything to scale is absolutely invaluable. So I argue for the battle being fought between the river and the hill on which the town of Cannae stands. This would mean that this is in a very confined space. At the most, we're talking about a width of about 3 kilometers from the hill to the river. So is it the maximum 3 kilometers for a battle line? That's assuming they go straight at sort of 90 degrees between the two. If there's more of an angle, then things are different. So this would mean that this was a very dense, crowded, narrow battlefield. For me, that makes sense. The day before, the Romans had declined an offer of battle from Hannibal to the north of the river. Now, the land there is very open. There are no features on which to rest your flanks. There's a lot more space. Hannibal's got better cavalry than the Romans. He's got more of it than the Romans. In previous battles, those cavalry have swept around the flanks and enveloped the Roman line. So the Romans know they don't want that to happen. The Romans have got tons of infantry. Their infantry has done well, has broken through the center at Trebia, at Trasimene. So for me, it makes sense. Fight somewhere narrow and restricted where, although you won't be able to deploy your numbers initially to the full, nevertheless, they can't be outflanked. The great strength of your army is protected, and you deliver a sledgehammer blow straight at the middle of Hannibal's line. So for me, that makes sense. And the fact that it is narrow is actually an argument in favor rather than an argument against it. On the other hand, some scholars have argued that, well, this is far too narrow, and of course, depending on where the river actually was, you might not have 3 kilometers, you might not have 2 kilometers, you might have even left, in which case the arguments for this become less and less likely. They've tended to position it to the south of the town, or to the east of the hill with the town, so that you still have the river on the same flanks of the army, but there is much more open country. There's nothing really to anchor the Roman left, the Carthaginian right, in the same way that you're between a river and a hill, if you're in the other position. This has the advantage of space. There's plenty of room for everybody. Disadvantages are this, however. One is that why fight here? How is this different from the land north of the river, where there's plenty of open space? So why would the Romans be willing to fight here when they hadn't been willing to fight somewhere else? And why bother to cross the river? You could have just challenged for battle on the north bank, if that's what you wanted to do, where Hannibal had offered it before. The other thing is, when I visited the site, I walked back, having got a lift down to Cannae. I walked back because I wanted to look at this ground, and there is a very clear, very definite slope down from the hill around Cannae towards the coast. So if you had deployed in this area, one thing is that the Carthaginian deployment and where the units were would have been more obvious to see, because they would be deployed up a slope, and any troops behind, in reserve, hidden like the Libyans, would have been easier to see, perhaps. I mean, again, you can argue about that. The other thing is the Romans would have been attacking uphill, and even a slight advantage like this on a fairly gentle slope is something that ancient armies take great trouble to avoid. So for that reason, I just don't buy this. But it's not a case that you can prove either way. And again, coming to test things is okay with this number of people in this sort of formation. How much space do they take? That's the great advantage of experiments like this.
As you can see, even the foremost historians on the matter are unable to draw definitive conclusions. Given the results of our upcoming simulations on the army formations, we find it more probable that the battle took place along the eastern plains. But regardless of the exact placement of the armies, many of the observations from this simulation of Cannae will apply to either hypothesis. With that being said, let us now proceed. Given the aforementioned uncertainties of the exact battle lines, we are lucky to at least be able to work off the known location of the town of Cannae, whose ruins can still be seen today. This is where we will begin our tour. It is late July in 216 BC. The hot summer sun beats down upon the dry lands of Apulia as the seasonal Volturnus blows in from the south. Where Roman farmers once ruled these lands, now Hannibal is their master. Over the past few weeks, the great Punic general has laid claim to the site, whilst campaigning in the Apulia region of southern Italy as part of his daring invasion of Roman territory during the Second Punic War. The town of Cannae itself holds strategic value as a large supply depot with a defensible position atop a ridgeline hill. As you can see, it has a commanding view of the surrounding plains, which are filled with open farmland. Also of note is the Orpheus River to the north, which lazily winds its way across the gently sloping landscape towards the coast of the Adriatic Sea, some 8 kilometers to the northeast. Though Hannibal controls the town, his army is too large to fit inside. Thus, he initially sets up camp outside, likely atop the nearby high ground. From here, he can still survey the area, whilst also maintaining ready access to the river, from which he can draw fresh water for thirsty men and horses. Within a few days, he observes dust clouds to the north from the vast Roman army, which has been shadowing his every move. Setting off in this direction, we see that several kilometers away, the consuls have established their own camp on the opposite side of the river. Here, they too can draw from its waters to refresh the troops. Circling the camp, we can marvel at its immense size. Housing over 100,000 men, each side of its perimeter easily measures over a kilometer across. This is a city on the move. The sheer scale means that it cannot stay in one place for long without suffering supply issues. Thus, to mitigate these problems and to secure access to the river, a second, smaller camp is built on the other side of the Orpheus. But such measures can only delay the inevitable. Soon the consuls will have to relocate, either to engage the Carthaginians or to continue avoiding them. Hannibal is well aware of this fact and wants a fight on this ground. To press the issue, he now moves his camp to the same side of the river as the main Roman position. Doing so would have taken the greater part of a day. Flying to this new camp, we see that it is somewhat smaller than that of the legions, but no less impressive in size. It too remains tethered to the river and must deal with issues of supply. Thus, as both sides now face off, they are up against a logistical ticking clock. But who will make the first move? Historically, scenarios such as this evolve into a psychological game between generals. Naturally, both sides wish to fight with the most advantages stacked up on their side before committing to an engagement. A large factor to consider is that each army has already dug in and will be at an advantage if the foe is forced to charge into their defences. But on the flip side, to remain passive in this manner betrays a lack of confidence, both to the enemy and to one's own soldiers. This can be even more important, as morale, after all, is what can win or lose a fight. Thus, commanders will often deploy troops in the open ground as a performative offering of battle. How far forward such battle lines are drawn is an additional barometer of an army's confidence. In this case, it is Hannibal who first offers battle on August 1st. Paulus, supposedly the more cautious of the two Roman consuls, holds command and refuses out of an apparent fear that the open ground here will be to the great advantage of the enemy's more numerous cavalry. Hannibal capitalizes on this morale boost with another ploy to gain an advantage. He now sends the Numidians across the river to chase off Roman foragers. Despite the nearby presence of both camps, they are impotent to prevent the harassment. It is another humiliating blow to the legions. Thus, as the more impetuous consul Varro prepares to take command the following day, he has been sufficiently goaded to make an aggressive counter-move. At dawn, on the 2nd of August, 216 BC, a red vexillum is raised outside the tent of Commander Varro. This is a traditional signal that battle is to be given. However, we must imagine that the troops had more advance notice than to wake up to such a sign. Orders would have been distributed the night before to the military tribunes and the praefecti of the Ali, whose job it was to disseminate the command down the ranks and to supervise its execution. Thus, as the sun rises, it lights upon the massing ranks of infantry formations already assembling into their unit columns along the open ground of the Intervallum. From here, they will be guided out, one behind the other, in a procession leading out to the battlefield. As the great coiled snake of the Roman army slowly unfurls, its immense size is evident by the laborious nature of the process. Arranged in column, it takes each legion roughly half an hour to simply leave the camp. Thus, with two camps spilling forth simultaneously from their main gates, we can approximate that it will take the 16 legions around 2 to 4 hours to fully emerge, when accounting for bottlenecks and other delays. From here, their multi-kilometer long bodies will slither into position, trampling through fields and splashing through waters. At the same time, Hannibal keeps a close watch on the Roman force. With spies and perhaps even intercepted deserters, he is informed of Consul Varro's decision to offer battle. Thus, as the direction of the enemy's advance is revealed, the Punic commander now directs his men to match course. The offer for battle has been accepted. Hannibal's army now emerges from its own coils and slithers across the land. As if to message his agreement to the Romans, a massive plume of dust now rises from the Punic camp. From the perspective of an observer miles away, it would appear as if the two sides were deliberately coordinating their intentions with smoke signals. But as the vast dust clouds rise higher in the skies and slowly advance towards one another, it is clear that a showdown of monumental proportions is about to take place. This is all noted by observers from Rome who ride back to the city to report on such tidings. By the time they arrive, the fate of Cannae will already have been determined. But now, let us race against the writing of history to watch as it unfolds. Along our battlefield, the units of either side are moving into position. By tradition, this takes place by first sending out a screen of light troops to cover the deployment of the main body. At Cannae, such a maneuver involves the mobilization of some 25 to 30,000 skirmishers. A prodigious amount of troops whose numbers alone would rival the largest battles of the medieval era. Here, they are but a holding force. Behind the skirmisher screen, the battle lines are drawn. This process involves the army columns marching to the extreme ends of the formation and falling into line. It is a simple process of follow the leader, which can be executed by even the most green troops. However, regardless of simplicity, deployments of this scale take time, and it can be many more hours before the last of the troops trickle in. From the ground level, it is entirely unclear to any of the participants what is going on beyond their immediate vicinity. They must simply trust in the process, while officers ride back and forth to coordinate the movements of a blind Goliath. Luckily for us, we can observe the entire battlefield from above. This is a view never experienced before, and thus never documented. As a result, our presentation is speculative reconstruction based on vague, myopically constrained sources. For some insight into the nuances of this reconstructive process, we can turn once more to military historian Dr. Adrian Goldsworthy.
Now, as is always the case with the ancient world, we don't have too much information about what was normal, what was typical, whether there was a standard formation for the maniple or whether it rather depended on circumstances in the ground where you were fighting. But the suggestion that they're many times deeper than they're wide rather suggests that that wasn't true and that they were shallower under normal circumstances. Beyond that, though, we don't have any details, so just how narrow, how deep, and how narrow were the gaps between individual maniples. There's a whole debate about the checkerboard formation and whether the gaps between maniples closed up when the fighting actually began or not. But in this case, clearly the gaps are made significantly smaller, therefore there's less need for that, there's less requirement for that. Just how you do it would depend, and remember, all of this is going to be guesswork. So we assume that because he talks about the units, which we normally translate as maniples as being there, you kept with the normal triplex acies the three lines of Hastati, Principes and Triarii, and that each individual maniple was narrower fronted, deeper and closer together with its neighbours on either side, and presumably the Latins that are on either flank in the ally are doing much the same thing. But again, precisely what that means, most ancient authors assume we know this sort of stuff. There's no need to tell or explain, therefore they don't bother. And the technical manuals, if they existed, have not survived. So that a lot of things we assume about ancient warfare, you will often hear said, and I've written it, that the standard depth, the typical depth for a Greek phalanx was 8 deep. There's very little evidence for that, really very, very little, and none at all for the Roman army of this period as to just what's going on.
When it comes to reconstructing Cannae specifically, we have founded our model upon the better understood dynamics of the Roman army. At a high level, we are confident from our sources that it consists of the allied cavalry to the east, the infantry in the center, and the Roman cavalry in the west. Zooming in begins to reveal some of the uncertainties. The infantry, for instance, here consists of just 14 legions, with the assumption that 2 entire legions have been left behind in camp, in keeping with Polybius's claim that 10,000 troops were held back to guard the baggage and threaten the enemy's camp. Zooming in closer, we see that the individual legions still maintain their multi-layered formation of infantry tiers, but have arranged themselves in a deep, tight formation rather than the more typical checkerboard pattern. This is an interpretation of Polybius's report that the maniples were, quote, closer together than usual and many times deeper than they were wide. Here we have assumed a total legionary depth of 50 men, though some scholars push this to an excess of 70 men. In either case, using standard troop spacing and accounting for gaps between units, we end up with a total depth of around 100 meters for the heavy infantry. This is an extremely unorthodox formation in light of the fact that most armies of the period drew up in files of 4 to 8 men or 10 to 20 meters deep. The reason being that while depth improves staying power, each added rank yields diminishing returns. Any extra manpower is better used to extend that unit's width with which to outflank one's foe. But at Cannae, the Romans have more than enough manpower to spare. Already, the infantry span almost 2 kilometers in width. By going deeper, the consuls apparently wish to ensure that their green troops are as insulated as possible from morale shocks. Dropping down to the ground perspective of a soldier in the midst of this formation, it is easy to see its psychological advantages. To all sides, one is surrounded by comrades, while the front lines are nearly a soccer field away. All this means that the vast majority of Roman troops can expect to do nothing more than stand in line and let the sheer weight of their ranks brute force its way to victory. If they are lucky, they might catch a glimpse of the action along the front. Zooming back out, we can now turn our attention to the cavalry. The nature of their formations are even less well understood, as will be emphasized by Dr. Goldsworthy.
When you come to cavalry, you have to think in a very different way to infantry, and that's quite hard for us to do because most of us don't necessarily know much about horses. We're certainly not used to horses in these sorts of numbers. You don't see thousands of cavalrymen anywhere in the world today. So even the big parades and the ceremonial units you have, they're not on that sort of scale. And when movies have extras mounted, they never have those sorts of numbers. And of course, these days they'll be adding lots of extra CGI horsemen. So the big blocks of Rohirrim you see in the Pelennor Fields in the Return of the King movie, they look very visually impressive, but that is not the way any real cavalry would operate. Because the whole point of cavalry is speed, maneuverability, movement. They are not like infantrymen who will go forward and perhaps best go forward slowly and then slog it out with the enemy. They'll charge, the enemy will run, or they will be chased back. You chase them till you start to get scattered, you start to get blown, they have reserves, then they chase you back, your reserves chase them back, and so on. Ancient authors characterize cavalry warfare as incredibly fluid, back and forth, quite hard to understand, and exactly the same pattern was still visible in the 18th, 19th century. You can read about Waterloo, and it's exactly the same there. That's the way lots of horses behave. So it's best not to think of big blocks similar to the infantry when we come to cavalry. And probably we're thinking more of troops, squadrons, individual units forming several lines but with large gaps between them to allow this maneuverability, to allow this flexibility, because you pack lots of horses closely together and you're just going to end up with a big stampede either forward or backwards, but something you can't control. Witness the defeat of the Pompeian cavalry at Pharsalus, where several thousand of them are stampeded by a relatively small number of infantry. They can't recover from that. And the less trained the horses are, the more important it is to keep them in separate blocks and separate units, because they just get excited and they're inclined to run in the same direction as everybody else. So you have to think of groups of 30 men like the Roman turma, 40, 50, 100, maybe 200. Units like that, but lots of them and in more than one line. Now that's a very different way of thinking about how these will be deployed to our standard nice little rectangle on a map where this represents 500, 1,000, 5,000 men. With cavalry in particular, you shouldn't think that way for infantry, but with cavalry it's fatal to think that way. They need lots more space, Polybius talks about cavalrymen requiring double the amount of frontage that infantry of the same numbers would require. But it's not quite as simple as, you just spread them out and each cavalryman requires twice the space. It's the units require space around them. So that's what mattered. We've got to think of lots of little blocks, a little bit like some of those 17th century woodcuts and engravings of English Civil War battles and that sort of thing.
With these ideas in mind, our model assumes that the Roman cavalry are compactly deployed in their 30-men termi, with separation between rows of units to allow for the more fluid engagement of mounted troops. As such, their frontage is about 600 meters across and 70 meters deep. Flipping to the other side, we can now examine the disposition of the Carthaginians. Here there is very little precedent to draw upon for their reconstruction. Thus, our model largely relies on matching the width of their Roman counterparts and adding depth to reach the troop counts given to us by our sources. Namely, this includes the roughly 4,000 Numidian cavalry under Hanno on the eastern flank, Gallic and Iberian cavalry under Hasdrubal on the western flank, and the 35,000 infantry under Hannibal and Mago in the centre. Of this last group, we have assumed that approximately 5,000 troops have been left back at camp to counter Rome's own 10,000 troops, which were siphoned off to threaten their baggage train. Diving deeper, we can now explore the infantry. It is here that Hannibal uses the non-Punic troops to form his famous crescent at the start of battle. Typical media depictions tend to over-exaggerate its shape without accounting for the practicalities of such a formation. In reality, it is likely that the battle line consisted of an eclectic mix of small warbands of around 200 to 500 men, which were arranged in echelon, one next to the other. In theory, each unit might advance further out than its neighbour to increase the overall bowing of the line. However, they would have been hesitant to advance too far and expose their flanks. Thus, by assuming that each unit overlaps significantly with its neighbour, our model results in a crescent with a maximum depth of a mere 85 metres at the centre. Given that the frontage of the infantry is almost 2 kilometres across, this is an exceptionally shallow crescent. Such a finding begins to cast doubt on traditional understandings regarding the purpose and function of the crescent at Cannae. This shall be discussed further when we simulate the actual combat along this front. For more thoughts on the matter, we can turn once more to Dr. Goldsworthy.
Anything that's unique is always harder to study because there aren't parallels. And there's nothing quite like this. There have been various theories that the naval battle of Ecnomus had similar tactics to Cannae and all this sort of thing, but none of them really hold any water or any weight. They just don't make sense. It's better to see this not as a plan that Hannibal had in the back of his mind for years, and I've got this cunning idea, but something tailored to his army in relation to the Roman army and where he was fighting and the circumstances of that battle. And the build-up to it, the campaign, something that's right for today and will work for today, because he's not doing the same thing elsewhere, and he doesn't try and do this again anywhere else. So that means it's difficult. The probability is that this is rather less dramatic and shallower than many diagrams will show, but then diagrams need to emphasize. So just what was necessary? The point clearly is that Hannibal wishes the very center of his line to get into contact before other parts of it. So the very central unit is advanced some distance, we don't know how far, is it 10 meters, 100 meters, more, whatever it might be. Again, this is something that the model can test very, very well and give us an idea of what this would look like. But a lot depends on how people would behave. So he wants the Romans to make contact there first. Is that in the expectation the rest of the Roman line will stop while that's being fought and until they're pushed back? Is it that this will start to make the Roman line more ragged as they begin to come forward, that some might attack, start their charge, start their volley of missiles at a greater distance? We'll come on to all of this later, but it's difficult to know precisely what Hannibal intends, so it's all a question of experimenting. It's bound to be shallower than the Roman formation because you're covering the same frontage as a far more numerically superior force of Romans. There's a lot of Romans out there, you're trying to match their frontage. But that also means that it's much less dense as to what's going on. There's more space for not just individual units to act and react and support each other, move backwards and forwards depending on how the fighting is going, but also for officers, commanders to move around.
Having covered the formation of the non-African infantry, we can now turn our attention to the Libyans. Our sources are unclear on their deployment, with Livy stating vaguely, quote, "They were used to form the two wings which had been drawn back." Some depictions show them stacked in deep columns. But once more, we should question the practicality of such exaggerated deployments. Working in true size, we see that there is little benefit to having the units so far back from the front. At the scales we are working with, any position they might adopt locally results in the equivalent distance required to move from the wings towards the center or around the flanks for an envelopment. Thus, we have chosen to deploy the Libyans at no greater depth than the legions whose formation was already considered overkill in terms of staying power. Ultimately, this seems to have been their role in battle: to hold as an unbreakable bastion of elite troops that could be mobilized when the time came to strike at vulnerable Roman forces. With this in mind, we can now turn to the cavalry on the wings. To the east, we find the Numidian light cavalry. Here, we have modelled them as loosely spaced units which can easily maneuver for evasive skirmishing against the enemy. The end result is a formation of equivalent numbers to the Roman allies opposite them, but with a greater overall footprint. Meanwhile, on the western flank, we find the Gallic and Iberian cavalry. They number about 2.5 times that of the Romans standing against them. The severity of this mismatch is reflected in our model by the idea that while they might intend to fight as close order cavalry, their great numbers have forced them to separate into multiple groups to preserve command and control and avoid devolving into a stampeding herd. Any one of these groups has sufficient strength to greatly damage the Roman cavalry on its own. Massed in this way, though, the combined might of the Carthaginians is poised to absolutely flatten them. Now that we have painstakingly laid out our model of the armies at Cannae, we can take a step back to appreciate the results of their true size. Based on our assumptions, it measures over 3 kilometers across. Let us now fly across the battlefield to get a more visceral sense of the scales involved. For a more grounded approach, we might even consider simulating a walk across the battlefield. But to do so would take roughly 40 minutes. Even when simulating a horse making the journey, it would take a rider around 5 minutes at full gallop to race from one end to the other. As a final measure of the battlefield's size, we can now fire off a Napoleonic cannon across its breadth. As the shot arches across the battlefield, it passes by endless ranks of soldiers. Even under the best conditions, the cannon's maximum range will only get us halfway across the field. The scales here are simply unfathomable. Given all this, we must marvel at what it would have been like to experience such an event where the scale of the conflict stretches from horizon to horizon. For soldiers, at least they can be resigned to focusing on the more comprehensible scope of their immediate surroundings. Leaders, on the other hand, are afforded no such luxury. The burden of command demands that generals and their officers must somehow remain apprised of matters across the entire front.
It's going to be very hard for anybody to see all of it. It's a big army, you're on a fairly flat plain, you don't have a vantage point. Your two senior commanders, your consuls, each choose to command one of the cavalry wings to keep those in the fight as long as possible so that the center can win. Once they're there, they can't see very much beyond the area immediately around them. They can see the enemy, but they can't see much more than that. One of the big drawbacks of reducing the gaps between the maniples, making the maniples deeper, but packing everybody into that space, is that there is less room for staff officers, senior officers, and their support staff to ride around the formation, to ride amongst the Roman line. It's much harder to get around. It's also harder to see anything. So the command and control element is a problem right from the very start. But again, it comes back to this: we've got a simple plan, all we've got to do is go forward and eat our way into the enemy line. In contrast to the Romans, Hannibal has a rather more conventional battle line. Yes, it's got the crescent and everything, but in terms of the depth of formations, how densely packed they are, there's no indication he's trying to match the Romans by cramming everybody in. His formations are relatively shallow in comparison to the Romans. There'll be intervals between the units. Not just, we can see that by the fact that he alternates Iberians and Gauls in the center of the line. These are clearly distinct units with some sort of space between them. That means that he and his brother and any other senior officers can see better what's going on, but can also move around. They can ride between units, they can ride along the battle line, they can ride behind them, they can get close to most of those units and talk to them, encourage them, set an example in a way that is much, much more difficult for the Romans in their far more crowded, dense formation.
All of this takes place in the calm before the storm. From here on out, the descent into the maddening true size of Cannae has only just begun. It's midday on the 2nd of August 216 BC, and the largest Roman army yet assembled has finally finished deploying for battle at Cannae. Opposite them stands the far smaller army of Hannibal Barca. What is about to transpire will go down as one of the most famed and studied battles of history. But never before has it been simulated to this level of detail. From fleshing out the unrecorded skirmishing action which occupied the bulk of the morning's action, to the messy realities of marching 70,000 infantry through obstacle-strewn farmland into the teeth of an echeloned battle line. The clashing of the cavalry across two wildly different engagements. The maneuvering of troops in each phase of the ensuing battle. And the final envelopment of the Roman army in what would prove to be one of the single bloodiest days of battle in history. We bring it all to life from both the bird's-eye perspective and the boots on the ground. This is the climactic conclusion of the Battle of Cannae. On the 2nd of August 216 BC, a red vexillum waved outside the tent of Consul Gaius Terentius Varro. After days of posturing across the plains of Cannae, it was finally time for battle. But even such a simple matter would take hours for the tens of thousands of troops to be led out of their camps and onto the battlefield. As both armies deployed for battle, their 3-kilometer fronts were screened by a mass of skirmishers numbering some 28,000 troops in total. An incredible host in its own right, whose assembled ranks would have dwarfed most battles of the medieval era. On the Roman side came the 20,000 velites, a class of young, poor levies equipped with simple javelins, small shields, and animal skin caps. Unlike the heavy infantry, they do not appear to have adopted any rigid formation or been accompanied by any formal officer rank. Thus, they deployed as a loose swarm with relative autonomy over their area of the battlefield. However, it is likely that some guidance was needed to coordinate their actions. Thus, we have assumed that the bands of velites remain relatively close to their parent maniples. This would have given them several hundred meters worth of buffer. Enough separation to perform screening actions, but close enough to fall back to the bastion of heavy infantry if pressed too heavily. Bridging this gap will likely have been runners or mounted messengers meant to maintain some level of coordination between the two groups. These presumably prowled the rear lines of the velites, keeping tabs on their ranks and peering over their heads in an attempt to glean some sense of the enemy's disposition. Opposite them stand their Carthaginian counterparts. At just 8,000 strong, they number less than half that of the Romans. Yet what they may lack in quantity, they more than make up for in experience. Among these ranks stand not poor young boys, but mature specialists, which include the Libyan Loncophori, the Iberian Caetrati, and the Balearic Sphedonitai. Most are armed with bundles of javelins and small round shields. Yet it is the last of these groups which would prove most formidable. Compared to the rest of the skirmishers, which largely relied on short-range weapons, these professional mercenaries wielded long-range slings capable of loosing lead bullets at speeds of over 100 kilometers an hour and ranges of up to 400 meters. Thus, as the two skirmishing bodies drifted close to one another, they were poised for an incredibly asymmetrical clash. But how exactly such fights occurred is left a mystery, as their details are rarely documented by our sources. We must imagine that these were rather fluid in nature. Each battle line, after all, was composed of a loose swarm, whose members would surge in and out of no man's land as packs or as individuals. To better conceptualize these dynamics, we can focus in on a small region of the front. Here, across a space no larger than a soccer field, are faced off 100 youths and 40 adults. Yet, unlike a friendly game, which might take place at the school sporting event, now both sides are armed with deadly weapons with no rules or referees to curb the violence. For the velites, this was reportedly a time to show one's courage in battle before comrades and superiors. Joining them on the front lines, we see what it might have looked like to step forth into the fray. Here we observe a mass of the enemy before us, just beyond the reach of our weapons. To strike them will require leaving the safety of our ranks. In a fit of courage, a young soldier might dash out to taunt the foe, dancing between incoming salvos, and toss their own javelin before pulling back. Others might more timidly emerge to collect spent weapons on the ground or pass them ahead to the more deserving. Likewise, the enemy does the same, though with greater strength and practiced accuracy. As this dance is repeated over the early hours of battle, we must imagine that rivalries would have formed as each group of skirmishers tested itself against the other across their slice of the battlefield. In areas where both sides are armed with javelins, perhaps there would have been a relative balance between the more numerous Roman youths and the more experienced Carthaginian adults. In other areas, perhaps a slight advantage was gained by one side or the other due to some particulars of the terrain, or as injuries and deaths began to take their toll on the morale of the participants. Yet now imagine what would have happened in areas where these same groups of javelin-armed velites were matched against the professional slingers of the Balearic Isles. Here, the youths would have been met with the ancient equivalent of gunfire. Lead bullets fired at extreme range, with such force that it could pierce armor and such accuracy that it could reportedly target individual parts of the face. The ensuing carnage is left to our imagination. Of our two primary sources, Livy is mute on the matter, while Polybius merely remarks, quote, "The affair between these light-armed troops was indecisive." Clearly, this skips over the very real life-or-death struggles which transpired in the earliest hours of the Battle of Cannae. But, without further information, we must move on. At some point, the skirmishing phase was called off by the waving of banners and the blaring of trumpets. Likely this occurred as the last of the heavy infantry and cavalry had reached their designated places in the battle line. By now, it would have been close to midday, with the sun beating down on the sweating brows of over 120,000 idling soldiers. The heat and their nerves left them dripping with anticipation to get this over with. Soon, this wish would be granted by the commanders who deemed it time for the battle to begin in earnest. Our sources claim that it was Hannibal who made the first move, sending forth his 10,000 cavalry against the Roman flanks. This would have begun at a walk or slow trot so as to maintain stamina and unit cohesion. Thus crossing the roughly half-kilometre separating the armies would have taken around 3 to 5 minutes. For a better idea of what this may have looked like, we can zoom in, beginning on the western flank. Here, the hooves of 6,000 Gallic and Iberian horses kick up large plumes of dust into the air. It is an impressive force, whose sheer size has forced them to break out into multiple waves of assault and reserve units, just to squeeze into the narrow battlefield between the infantry and the river. When these units get closer to the Romans, the first of their ranks will begin to pick up speed. Officers shout encouragement to their squad mates, while steeds vocalize their own emotions to the herd. As momentum builds, each individual is now swept along in a growing avalanche, enveloped by deafening sound and blinding dust. To participate in such a charge must have been an incredible rush of adrenaline. The more than twice outnumbered ranks of the equites have taken a defensive posture alongside the river.
Do not concern yourself with those Carthaginians yonder. Few will be honest sons of Carthage, if there is such a thing. Carthaginians, cowards all, pay others to die for them. Let us give them death.
Livy's account claims that around this time, the consul Paulus dismounted after being wounded by a slinger, leading many other Romans to do the same. Though this is not backed up by other sources, it does perhaps preserve some tradition of cavalry having chosen to fight on foot in an attempt to bolster their static position. Whatever the case, it seems clear that the Romans were indeed aware that they were doomed to be defeated on this flank. It was just a matter of delaying the inevitable as long as possible for the infantry to win the day. To get a true sense of things, we can drop down to the front lines. Here, the coming of the Carthaginians is heralded by rising dust clouds and the crescendo of hoofbeats. Soon, this is followed by the haunting appearance of a dark line rolling swiftly over the countryside. For a soldier in the center of formation, observing this horizon-spanning avalanche of flesh and iron will have shaken them to the core. The dire nature of Rome's predicament is only further reinforced as we zoom out to see that beyond this first wave of Carthaginians are two more great waves of death hurtling towards them. To make matters worse, we are told by Polybius that unlike typical cavalry engagements, quote, there was none of the usual formal advance and retreat, but when they once got to close quarters, they grappled man to man and dismounting from their horses, fought on foot. In our model, we have depicted this as a literal smashing together of the front ranks. From a distance, this is relatively easy to conceptualize, as it aligns with the way such engagements are typically shown in games and movies. However, it proves far harder to imagine the realities on the ground. Here would have been a roughly 500-meter wide, rolling mass of man and beast. Unlike the infantry blocks, which can be expected to have some level of rigidity in their fighting, the cavalry were entirely more fluid, given the inherent nature of being mounted upon animals. In some cases, man and horse worked together to fight with some semblance of coordination. Other times, a rider was at the mercy of their steed's unpredictable motions. All the while, slashes, stabs, and javelin throws were being exchanged. Brute force even had its place as riders reportedly resorted to physically dragging each other off the saddle. On the ground would have been strewn the carnage of trampled men, crippled horses, spent weapons, and dismounted troops who now waded through the mayhem. Understandably, the fighting would have been brutal. Our sources claim that the Romans fought with great spirit and determination. However, the numerical odds were stacked heavily against them. It was only a matter of time before the crushing might of the Carthaginians broke through. But for now, let us pivot over to the eastern flank. Here we find an entirely different dynamic at play. On this front, the Carthaginians have deployed the 4,000 Numidian light cavalry. Specializing in hit-and-run tactics, these troops will have surged out towards the Roman line in nimble squadrons. Once in range, they then loosed their javelins before wheeling about. From the Roman perspective, this would not have been as immediately deadly as the brutal charge on the western flank, yet it was nonetheless extremely trying on the nerves. The refusal of the enemy to come to blows denied the Equites a chance to relieve stress through violence. Instead, they were subjected to an incessant needling. From a ground's eye view, we can see how unnerving this would have been. Yet, any attempt to break ranks and chase after the Numidians would have had the effect of chasing after a flock of birds. Lighter and faster, they simply darted out of the way and into the unknown dangers of the dust-shrouded ground beyond. Over-pursuing in such a situation would have tired out one's steed and potentially left Romans isolated. At this point, Numidian squadrons would have closed in to pick them off. Such tactics would have been enabled by the use of multiple self-reinforcing ranks of reserves, behind which skirmishers could rally and relieve one another. In this way might the fighting be dragged out for hours. Thus we see the highly dynamic nature of the eastern flank, which slowly but inexorably sapped the strength of the Romans. As the fighting on the flanks occurred, it was now the turn of the Romans to take the offensive by advancing their main body of heavy infantry. Once more, it should be emphasized that even such a seemingly simple maneuver was made complex by the sheer scale of the task at hand. After all, we are talking about coordinating the actions of 70,000 individuals across a roughly 2-kilometer wide front. For more on the matter, we can turn to historian Adrian Goldsworthy.
Once you've got your army in position, you also have to, once you're ready, decide to order it forward. We don't get any specifics about this. We assume that it's done by signal, in that you have trumpets blowing, standards perhaps moved, the commander's standard moved in a particular way, or maybe just the trumpet signal that is then taken up by trumpeters along the line and everybody goes. It's probably not as neat and everyone's stepping off at exactly the same time on the same foot sort of thing. Again, this is a big, inexperienced army, bigger than anything the Romans have ever known before, so nobody really knows how to do things. You're trying to modify your normal practices as little as possible to keep everybody understanding what's going on. In later periods, in the 1st century BC, we hear at Philippi, Brutus sends out dispatch riders to give the order to advance to all the different elements of his army, and as a result, various legions, each one goes when it gets the order and just heads off, so that the ones that are nearest to him get theirs first and start the attack first, and the others come in later. And clearly his staff of this fairly amateur Civil War army had not worked out that this was likely to happen. At Thapsus, one of Caesar's battles, where the advance begins without his instructions, Caesar was trying to stop them, and one cohort forces its trumpeter, its cornican, to signal the order to advance and starts going, and then the order is taken up, everybody repeats the signal and everybody goes, and Caesar is supposed to have said, all right, fair enough, let's get on with it and attack. So even with the more professional armies of that period, admittedly in a civil war situation, you could get moments of confusion. So it's, again, we've got these nice digital figures representing our Roman soldiers, but remember, everybody's an individual, everybody's a human being, and this is not the most experienced Roman army around.
But if the start of an advance was already messy, the march itself proved even more so. This had much to do with the inherent variability of the participants, the terrain, and the conditions. For much of our model, we've been forced to simplify such variables. But in this section, we shall attempt to dial up the realism to give you a better idea of the real experience. Here, Dr. Goldsworthy shall once more be our guide.
As the Romans move forward, their formations will start to decay, at least to some extent. Important thing to remember is that even though Cannae is fought in what we consider to be a flat plain, in that there are no major terrain features recorded in our sources or obvious from the ground today, and that's true wherever it takes place, whichever of the theories is followed, that real landscapes, particularly farmland, are not like carefully mown football pitches or bowling greens or anything like that. This is real land, so it won't be perfectly flat. There will be little undulations, there'll be little humps and bumps. Because it's farmland, people have been using this. There's going to be tracks, there's going to be walls, there's going to be boundary stones. There are going to be perhaps hedges, trees, vines in places. We don't know what was being grown there at the time of the battle, but there could be animal pens, there could be drainage ditches. All of these things. And, people being very clear, farmers marking out, this is mine, this is yours, and that's the boundary you don't cross. So all of these things will mean that not everybody is going to be going at a perfectly steady, regular pace, straight forward. People will tend to veer a bit to the right, a bit to the left. Some groups will move faster than others. You get the very keen officer who's urging people forward, who always half anticipates goes too soon, the other who's a bit sluggish, who's a bit slower, a bit more cautious. So the little bits of the micro landscape, in a sense, that we can't represent, we've got no chance at all, even if we locate the battlefield, of knowing what this was, and would never appear in an account by a Polybius or a Livy or anyone like this, because it mattered to the dozen or so men who were marching along that bit of frontage, and those behind them. It doesn't matter to anybody else. Many people would never know it was there at all. There might be the odd building out there, the odd hut as well. Who knows what was there? Fences, anything, lots of things like this. So it's going to get messy fairly quickly. This is human nature. Added to the stress of all this, you are advancing towards an enemy that you can see and that is waiting to kill you, or perhaps soon coming forward to kill you. And even however keen you are, this is still, a pretty nervous moment for anyone. With all the excitement, the noise, the hubbub of all those people, and the sense of, again, being with this army is probably the time when you're seeing more human beings in any one place than you ever have before. When that army raises its battle cry, it's probably louder than anything you've heard in your life before, particularly for many of the Romans and the less experienced ones. So this is a very novel situation. As the Romans advance, there isn't a great deal that their officers can do. The consuls are off on the flanks. The centurions, 2 with each maniple in theory, 6 tribunes with a legion, they can influence the men immediately around them, anyone who can hear their voice and then is willing to listen to it. It's mainly a question they can try and keep the pace steady. They can try and stop people from surging forward too quickly, breaking up formation even faster than it's going to happen. They can try and encourage them. They can try and cheer them. Polybius talks about the Roman lines, Roman troops regularly advancing, cheering and banging their weapons against their shields. So if you've got that sort of noise, then it's all the harder for officers to compete with that, for trumpet signals to compete with that. But again, think of the volume you might get from the crowd at a sporting event, the cheering, the chanting you can have. It's that sort of volume of noise. So the Romans can't do a lot apart from keep everybody moving forward, try and keep them in some sort of order and fairly steady, but they're not doing anything very, very clever. And there are limits, again, comes back to this dense formation that's going to be deteriorating even further. For anyone on horseback that gives them a bit of a viewpoint higher than everyone else, it's going to be hard to move around the battle line because there's not the space there would normally be between maniples, even in the approach to combat. So all of these things restrict what they can do, but they can certainly encourage each other and try and keep things reasonably steady. In contrast, the Carthaginian commanders have a more normal deployment. Hannibal, his brother Mago, who's there in the center of the line, they can ride around. They can ride between the units, they can ride up to them, they can encourage the men that they want to, as far as they can in terms of the ability to speak the languages of the different units involved. The Iberians in particular have been, serving for a long time under Hannibal and his family, so they're men he knows well, and he probably can communicate with them. The Gauls have been with him for less than 2 years, but again, that's, a time to build up some sort of relationship. So they can do more, they can see more. Everybody's going to be a little bit confused. Between the two armies, you've got this large numbers of skirmishers fighting their own little battle. He can see what's going on there, probably better than the Romans can. Whether he contributes to this at all, or whether the skirmishers and the officers with them just do their job and they have supports organized and all that sort of thing, very hard to say. But Hannibal is in a better position than the Romans to see what's going on, but it is still quite difficult in a battle of this size for any one man to be somewhere where he can see all that's going on and be able to respond to it.
Eventually, after what likely took around 7 to 10 minutes of marching, the leading Roman infantry units would have come within striking range of the Carthaginians' crescent formation. However, its echeloned nature further complicated the meeting of the two armies. Presumably, fighting would have begun among the most protruding units where Hannibal and his brother directly supervised the troops. Here, battle likely took place in the usual manner, with the Romans charging and launching their pila at the enemy. Likewise, the Gallic and Iberian infantry on the receiving end of the attack also charged at the last moment with their own flurry of missiles. But what happened to either side of this first contact point? This is where things start to get even more confusing, with no clues offered from our sources. Thankfully, the true size nature of our model can offer some insight on the matter. One effect may have been that the crescent blunted the force of the usual Roman assault. By echeloning units backwards, we see that as the Romans get close to the line of first contact, the Carthaginians are further and further away. By the time you reach the edges of the infantry, the gap is as large as 100 meters. For troops caught up in the momentum of the charge, resonating out from the center of the crescent, having to cover this extra football field's worth of ground must have impacted their stamina and psychology. We know this was a serious issue to consider. At the Battle of Pharsalus, for instance, Caesar's troops actually stopped mid-charge to redress their lines when they observed the enemy was not advancing to meet them. On this occasion, the veteran troops were able to halt, reform, and re-engage for a more optimal fight. At Cannae, however, the Roman army was far greener and unlikely to have been able to pull off such a feat. Thus, the troops at the extremes of the line were likely faced with suboptimal conditions. With the extra distance to travel, Did they now run and arrive exhausted? Did they throw their peeler too early? Did they slow down and hesitate to engage? Unfortunately, we simply don't know. But whatever occurred, the crescent seems to have helped further delay and disorganize the infantry attack. A brilliant move on Hannibal's part to counter Rome's greatest strength. But no matter how blunted the legion's charge may have been, the sheer weight behind the assault meant that it was only a matter of time before the Punic line began to cave in. We are told by our sources that this occurred in the centre. Here, Livy writes, quote, "This wedge was first driven back so far as to straighten the front, and then, continuing to yield, even left a hollow in the centre." Other sources back up the idea that the Carthaginian crescent was inverted over the course of the fighting, but how was this achieved? Polybius mentions the enemy giving ground, which serves as a convenient explanation. But military historians have thrown much doubt upon its feasibility. After all, pulling off such a complex maneuver was difficult enough on the parade ground, let alone in the thick of fighting. Even if one could perform such a thing, there is the problem of doing so over a significant distance without disintegrating into a rout. To better grasp this issue, we can simulate what bowing the line actually would have looked like from the ground level. As hundreds of meters fly by, you start to truly understand how great a distance this is. By the time you get to a 600-meter full back point, you are likely further away from the front than the two armies were from each other at the start of battle. Thus, no matter the mechanism of the retreat, it seems far more plausible to assume that any inverting of the crescent would have been far shallower than most diagrams would lead you to believe. That being said, we cannot definitely rule out a large retreat or even a breakthrough occurring. But for our model, we have assumed a shallow inversion. As for how this was achieved, a controlled retreat over such a small distance does start to seem more plausible, especially when we reimagine what extended infantry combat may have looked like. This is best explained by Dr. Goldsworthy himself.
We do know that the Romans start to push back the centre of Hannibal's line. They push back the crescent in the centre, perhaps break through it, at least at some point. How this occurs comes into all sorts of questions about just how ancient warfare, ancient infantry combat did actually develop, did actually happen. In the Hollywood image is everybody runs together, fights individual duels, and nearly everybody from which somebody dies in all of these things, and then somehow they know they've won or they haven't. Real life isn't like that. It's about groups, it's about units going forward, trying to inspire each other, officers trying to lead them. So it fits more with the model that people like Phil Sabin and I have developed, where you get bursts, pulses almost of combat, where because hand-to-hand combat is physically incredibly demanding and emotionally demanding, but it's physically hard work. Ask a fencer, martial artist, boxer, someone like that, how tired they get, even somebody as highly trained as that, after short bouts of combat. Then add in the weight of weapons and the stress that somebody's actually trying to kill you. Then you can't do this for 10 minutes, let alone hours on end. It will be short bouts of combat after which the two sides separate, perhaps only the distance of 10 feet or so. That would make them safe, maybe even less. If you're outside the distance anyone can thrust a spear or stab with a sword, then unless they've got something to throw at you, you're safe. While you get your breath back, you get your enthusiasm back, and then you go forward again, renew the combat. So whether that's both sides step back, whether that's one side steps back, perhaps because it feels it's not quite so confident, not doing quite so well, you do get mentions in ancient battles of a side being pushed back a considerable distance without apparently breaking and running. So although that might be hard for us to imagine, within this context, that seems to be fairly typical of a lot of ancient infantry combat. You've got lots of Roman leaders encouraging them. You've also got Hannibal, Mago, other officers encouraging the Gauls, the Iberians to keep fighting. So it is presented as a very hard struggle. The Romans do not simply punch through the centre quickly. This takes time. And again, we can look at the overall casualty rate for Hannibal's army. It does seem very high for a victorious army, and the emphasis is that many of your leaders go. Now, they're not all falling at this stage, but it emphasises how hard this fighting is.
But all of this action in the centre would have taken time. Meanwhile, the cavalry engagements, which had begun earlier, would have been reaching their climax. Our sources claim that the action peaked on the western flank first. Here we find that the rolling cavalry engagement has resulted in a ragged battle line. This would have been particularly true around the wings, as the more numerous Carthaginians attempted to outflank their prey. Along the river's edge, such affairs would have been complicated by the rushing waters and muddy banks. But certainly there would have been some messy fighting across such contested ground. Across the opposite side of the cavalry brawl, the open fields would have presented better opportunities for maneuver. Here we can imagine that cavalrymen tentatively made their way through the dust clouds, feeling out the edges of the foe's formation. Away from the pack, more isolated and fluid fighting could have occurred between individuals or small groups. Crucially, Carthage's advantage of reserves would have more easily allowed them to exploit any vulnerabilities which developed. Eventually, the pressures along the front, and especially the envelopment around the flanks, would have cracked Rome's morale. First as a trickle, then as a deluge. Riders broke away from the fighting, fleeing for their lives. With cavalry, such an affair would have happened even faster than a rout amongst infantry. Adrenaline-fueled mounts now made for the countryside, perhaps hoping to make safe at the camps to the rear. Others, such as Consul Paulus in the case of Polybius's account, even attempted to rejoin the infantry. But Carthage was in hot pursuit. As avenues of retreat were cut off, it is likely that many desperate Romans made way for the river. Such a sight must have been incredible to behold, as hundreds of troops now spilled into the shallow waters. If our sources are to be trusted, few made it across alive. Certainly, many Carthaginian squadrons kept up the pursuit to drive the victory home. However, their commander Hasdrubal acted with great skill and discretion by reining in many of his troops for a charge across to the other side of battle. Such restraint is incredibly rare in ancient battles, especially in the chaos of a pursuit. However, our model shows that this action was likely made far more practical by the use of reserves who may well have been kept detached for this very moment. Now, such troops could have easily wheeled into columns for an efficient transit across the battlefield. Viewed from the rear of the Roman infantry, this decisive action might have been glimpsed as an ominous billowing of dust clouds moving against the wind. Meanwhile, on the eastern flank, the indecisive fighting between the Numidians and the Roman allies raged on. Yet, amidst the indecisive fighting, a turning of the tides may have been sensed by the observation of dust clouds from the west. The final revelation that these were enemy reinforcements would have been swift, as their columns now fanned out to envelop the pinned foe. This pending disaster led to an immediate collapse of the Roman position. Just as had occurred in the west, the eastern flank now disintegrated. From above, we can see this destruction of the cavalry elements. Once more, Hasdrubal shows great command by sending off the Numidians in pursuit, while he himself rallies the remainder of the cavalry to strike at the exposed rear of the enemy's centre. But this all will have taken precious time. Meanwhile, as we return to the fight in the centre, we see that the nature of the fight has evolved. The first major change is that the Romans have pushed back, if not partially broken through, the Carthaginian centre. The second change is that in the process of doing so, their formation has lost all cohesion. On the ground level, we can see why this might be the case. Here, individual soldiers at the front have shifted around in the process of fighting or rotating in and out of combat. Meanwhile, units further to the rear have also lost order as they slowly advance with the front lines or naturally expand to fill gaps in the formation. This has had the effect of turning them into a wholly unmanageable mob. But for now, such a state proves viable enough to still bully their way through the Carthaginian ranks, which is only a few dozen meters deep. As they do so, we are told by our sources that the Libyans on the wings now swing in to strike them from the flanks. However, looking at our model, it is difficult to understand how exactly this will have worked. One option would have been to simply turn to the side and attack the units next to them. But this assumes that there was an exposed flank to strike at, with no friendly forces in the way. Another option would have been for the Libyans to commit to a grander maneuver, walking nearly a kilometre to reach a breakthrough in the centre or to wrap around the Roman rear. Either of these would have taken a considerable amount of time and control to execute. We shall let Dr. Goldsworthy shed light on the matter.
Cannae does seem to be unique in the way the Libyans function. There are sometimes troops kept back to be committed later, and of course at Zama he'll have 3 lines mirroring the Roman deployment, but they're not doing the same sort of manoeuvring that these Libyans do at Cannae. The deployment, though, is fundamentally unusual because you've had these Libyan troops, the pick of your troops, in reserve. For most armies, reserves aren't really a big feature of what they do. I mean, the Romans have them, the standard triplex acies, 3 lines, though again you could see this more as waves rather than as true reserves. Only in a few battles and only later do we hear about sections of a second or third line being taken off to do something else. So Cynocephali, for instance, where maniples in the rear are taken off to deal with the collapse of the Roman left flank. So again, it comes back to that sense that Cannae is a unique situation. The tactics there are not part of some long-term plan that Hamilcar and then Hannibal have been toying with over the decades and trying to perfect. But it's actually something that Hannibal has come up with for this situation and facing this particular Roman army. So it meets the tactical requirements of this particular problem. A much bigger Roman army, loads of infantry, and maybe it also has some sense of what the battlefield is like, what space there is that I can do this. It's very vague, but there are lots of ways it could be happening, and we probably oversimplify because, again, we rush through the tactic and we want it to happen really quickly. We also tend to assume that the battle is a fluid, constant thing without lulls in the fighting, without delays. Even in this breakthrough that the Romans have come forward, there are some units still standing up against them, at least holding them a little way, and the Romans hesitate, rest, get their breath back, come forward again and attack. All the attacks later on will tend to consist more of hand-to-hand combat because as the battle continues, those men with missiles have probably thrown them. So you might have light infantry supporting them, but in the main, you're having to get the energy, the motivation, the enthusiasm to charge forward again, fight hand to hand and hope the enemy breaks. So there's a lot more slog and attrition. Even with this Roman success, we probably are wrong to think of it as happening really quickly and everybody rushing through and then the Libyans somehow, running a 4-minute mile or so to get up to in neat formation to hit the Romans in the flank and trap them. The whole thing is probably a lot more gradual than we tend to imagine, and it may happen unit by unit rather than each wing of Libyans doing everything at the same time.
But however it happened, it seems that the commitment of the Libyans helped further stall the Roman advance, which had been on the precipice of a substantial breakthrough. Perhaps, even at this late juncture, the legions may yet have had the strength to press on. Yet, this is when Hannibal's cavalry finally returned to the fight. Joining them may well have been the Punic skirmishers, who go unmentioned by our sources. If it was indeed Hannibal's ultimate plan to strike a decisive blow to the rear, it makes sense for at least some of these units to have wrapped around the flanks to assist them on this mission. But even still, with cavalry and skirmishers at the rear, there was a nearly 2-kilometer wide stretch of open ground for them to somehow cover. The scales involved are made clear in our model and force us to contemplate how this might actually have happened. Once more, Dr. Goldsworthy will guide us through this thought exercise.
So you've got your mass of legionaries, mostly the heavy infantry, Hastati, Principes, Triarii in particular at the back. But you've also got the velites. Where have they gone? They've pulled back, particularly if they've used their missiles. So you're adding in lots of other people into this mass of a crowd. And again, under normal circumstances, the heavy infantry could turn round, form up, charge and drive off the light infantry. They probably won't catch them, but they can keep them at some sort of distance. But you can't do that if there's lots of cavalry there, because then your formation is going to break up, you're going to be vulnerable to the flanks. As you charge forward, you'll tend to scatter. It's the sort of thing that happened at Carrhae in the 1st century BC, where you can try and drive the enemy off, but then you end up as a knot of infantrymen that's either going to be shot by missiles, hit by missiles that are thrown, charged in the flank, charged in the rear. So that combination of cavalry and light infantry, which we can guess might be coming in, closing in on the Roman rear, is a very formidable one in these circumstances, because the Romans are not an organized battle line anymore. Again, this is something the model shows well, because you can get a sense of how much area these cavalry could occupy, particularly, again, think of them as groups, troop sizes, squadron sizes, 50, 100, 200 or so. Lots of groups rather than 1 or 2 big blocks, supported by light infantry that can form up with some supports, but also with most going forward as a skirmish line. And they can move. They're not static. They can charge in, they can pull back, they can charge again. So you're being worn down and it's sapping the strength. The probability is, though, and clearly the figures afterwards show, that some Romans, substantial numbers of them, do break out of this encirclement, which again comes back to this idea it's a very wide area behind the Roman formation and the cavalry don't seal it off completely. Some knots of men will break out, probably to be amongst the ones that surrender in the camps afterwards. And some of the survivors, people like Scipio Africanus, they get out somehow or other. So it's never completely sealed, but it's very difficult and dangerous to get out in only small numbers, and they will do so only if they're very determined to stick together and fight their way out, not fight their way to sort of stabilize the line.
Thus, we now arrive at the end of tactical maneuvers of the battle. All troops have been committed and their fates sealed by the hours' worth of grappling between the 2 great wrestling armies. The end result is that the Roman army has been pinned such that any observing referee would call an end to the match. But in war, there is no such arbiter. So, what can history tell us about the fate of armies caught in similar predicaments?
Now, armies have got trapped and surrounded before in other battles on smaller scales, and they've been sometimes shot down from a distance. Think of the Spartans on Spectaria. Much smaller action, but nevertheless gives you an idea of how a more numerous, more maneuverable group can take out heavy infantry. There have been these disasters. There have been mass slaughters in particularly some of Alexander's victories over the Persians, where at Issus, at Gaugamela, even think of the Greek mercenary infantry and the other Persian infantry at the Battle of the Granicus, where they effectively get abandoned by their cavalry that's been driven off, they get surrounded and they're wiped out. 2,000 are taken prisoner, allowed to surrender and sent back in chains to slave in the mines, but the rest are just slaughtered. Now, Alexander loses a horse while he's leading. There is still fighting going on, but it is very one-sided. The casualties are overwhelmingly suffered by the beaten army, by the mercenaries and the other Persian troops, how many there are there. So these sorts of things have happened, but never quite as deliberately as at Cannae.
As Dr. Goldsworthy suggests, there is indeed a uniqueness to the nightmare at Cannae which ensued. We can drop down to the point of view of a Roman soldier for perspective. Ancient authors shed some light on the matter with brutal anecdotes of trapped soldiers so tightly packed that they could no longer lift their weapons to defend themselves, while others buried their heads in the sand to hasten their own demise. On top of this, we must add the undocumented toll that heat, exhaustion, and deadly crowd surges must have had on the mob of Romans caught in the ever-tightening vice grip of the Carthaginians. Yet, even with all the attrition they had endured so far, the legions still represented a body of troops far more numerous than the Carthaginians who surrounded them. This posed a unique logistical problem for Hannibal's men on how to actually dispose of their trapped foe.
What you have to remember is that the 50,000 or so Romans and Italians that die in this phase of the battle have to be killed at very short range by muscle-powered weapons. Some of them can be shot down by sling bullets, they can be hit by thrown javelins, other missiles. But most, you're going to have to go forward and within arm's length, within that distance, kill them with sword, with spear, with any other weapons. The story of Cannae is one of great tactical subtlety, skill, but also of extreme brutality. This is a very nasty encounter. This level of slaughter in this area is probably amongst the most vicious and costly of all ancient battles, focused in such an area. The pursuits after Alexander's victories tend to be spread out over a little bit longer, though you still get the nightmarish stories of sort of bridging the Issus with corpses, much as you'll get the stories of the Aphidius being bridged with corpses. There's this theme. There is a sense, yes, a lot of the sources from Livy, Appy and the like get a bit carried away, but the nightmarish element probably is a reasonable reflection of just what this was like. You have to be killed close up, and it has to be done by muscle power, and those Romans don't just die, though they are again suffering far heavier losses because they're not an organized fighting line. They're just masses of desperate, terrified men, some of them fighting to the end, some of them perhaps giving in, but all having to be killed one by one. This is probably lasting hours to kill all these people, because the Carthaginians are not machines. They can't keep fighting. They've got to rest and then go forward again. And every time that's going to be harder. Their swords will be blunted. You know, we have the grim statement attributed to Hannibal that at Zama he thought his front two lines would take the edge off the Roman swords and weapons before they reached his veterans who could show them. But that is actually true. You know, the edges on these things, all of this is driven by muscle power. The more they strike into flesh, into bone, into muscle, the more they strike armor, the blunted they're going to get, and the harder it will be to drive them home. So it's grim, it's appalling, it's very gruesome, but that's the nightmare of Cannae, is this mass slaughter.
By the time the sun began to set on the battlefield, the final tally of destruction was staggering. Over 50,000 men lay dead or dying in an area little more than a few square kilometers across. More than half the Roman army had fallen, including a consul, 2 proconsuls, 29 military tribunes, 30 senators, 300 nobles, and many more souls, whom the history books do not tally. Even Hannibal suffered losses as high as 8,000, or roughly 16%, an exceptionally deadly percentage for a victorious army. To this day, Cannae remains one of the bloodiest single-days battles in history. The fallout from this event is best covered in another video. For now, we will bring our own discussion to an end. Looking back on this exercise of modelling Cannae in true size, we hope that it has given you a better understanding of what happened on that day. both from the perspective of how ancient armies deploy, maneuver, and fight, but also from the perspective of the individuals involved, whose human experience should not be overlooked, and whose understanding is vital for properly bringing the past to life. A huge thanks again to Dr. Goldsworthy for helping develop this detailed model of Cannae and for coming on as a speaker in this series. If you enjoy our work, consider supporting us on Patreon to participate in polls, catch script previews, and get HD downloads of all our art. We owe a huge debt to our current patrons for funding the channel and to our researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without this team and this community. So, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.